In the glittering world of Hollywood, where fame and legacy often intertwine, sometimes the most powerful moments happen when the cameras are rolling, but no one expects what comes next. On what seemed like an ordinary evening of late-night television, viewers witnessed an exchange that would quickly become the talk of social media and beyond. Gene Hackman's daughter, a woman who had largely avoided the spotlight despite her famous lineage, found herself face-to-face with one of television's most notoriously sharp-tongued hosts. What happened next left everyone watching from home, to those in the studio audience, completely speechless. Comment where you're watching from today, because this is one confrontation you won't soon forget. The television studio hummed with the familiar energy of a live broadcast. Bright lights illuminated the sleek set, while makeup artists made last-minute touches on the host's already perfect appearance. Carson Williams, known for his quick wit and sometimes cutting remarks, sat confidently behind his desk, reviewing note cards for his next segment. His show, Late Night with Carson, had dominated ratings for the past 5 years, largely due to his unpredictable interview style that often pushed celebrities out of their comfort zones. Tonight's lineup included the usual mix of A-list actors promoting their latest projects, a musical performance from an up-and-coming artist, and a special segment featuring Elizabeth Hackman, daughter of legendary actor Gene Hackman. While her father had been a titan of American cinema for decades, Elizabeth had forged her own path away from acting, becoming an acclaimed documentary filmmaker focused on environmental causes and social justice. The audience settled into their seats, phones reluctantly tucked away as production assistants reminded them of the no recording policy. The air conditioning worked overtime to combat the heat from the lights, creating an almost imperceptible hum beneath the pre-show music. Behind the scenes, Elizabeth waited in the green room, reviewing her talking points about her latest documentary, exposing corporate pollution in rural communities. Unlike many guests who came with publicists and entourages, she had arrived alone, dressed in a simple black blazer over a white blouse, professional without being flashy. 3 minutes to air, called the floor director, as crew members scurried to their positions. Carson straightened his designer tie and flashed his trademark smile to the makeup artist, giving him a final powder. "Who's our first guest again?" he asked his producer, who stood just off camera. "Elizabeth Hackman, Gene Hackman's daughter. She's promoting that documentary about water contamination in the Midwest." Carson nodded absently, his interest visibly waning at the mention of a documentary rather than a blockbuster film. "Right, the environmental thing. Got it." The opening monologue went smoothly, with Carson delivering razor-sharp jokes about the day's political headlines and celebrity gossip. The audience responded enthusiastically, energized by his confident delivery and the occasional barb that walked the line between humor and cruelty. This was Carson's specialty, the ability to say what others might think, but would never vocalize. And now, our first guest tonight is making waves with her new documentary, Silent Poisoning. She's also the daughter of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman. Please welcome Elizabeth Hackman. The audience applauded politely as Elizabeth walked onto the stage with a warm smile. She shook Carson's hand firmly before taking her seat. For viewers familiar with her father's commanding presence in films like The French Connection and Unforgiven, there was something in her composed demeanor that echoed his strength, despite her different career path. "Elizabeth, welcome to the show," Carson began, leaning back in his chair. "I have to say, when I heard Hackman, I was hoping your dad might come out of retirement for us." Elizabeth's smile didn't falter. "He's enjoying his retirement very much, thank you. He sends his regards." "So you've made a documentary," Carson continued, emphasizing the word as if it were somehow less significant than other filmmaking. "About water pollution?" He glanced at his notes with an exaggerated squint. "Yes, Silent Poisoning follows 3 communities in the Midwest whose water supplies have been contaminated by chemical runoff from factories," Elizabeth explained, her passion for the subject evident in her voice. "These are families who have experienced increased cancer rates, developmental issues in children." "Fascinating," Carson interrupted, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I've got to ask what everyone's thinking. With a father like Gene Hackman, why documentaries? Couldn't you have gotten a role in, a real movie?" He delivered the question with a smile, but there was an unmistakable edge to his words. A subtle shift occurred in Elizabeth's posture. Those familiar with her father might have recognized the slight narrowing of her eyes, the same expression Gene Hackman often displayed in films just before his character would deliver a powerful revelation or confrontation. The audience tensed, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere. "I'm curious, Carson," Elizabeth said calmly. "What exactly constitutes a real movie in your estimation?" Carson chuckled, seemingly unaware he was walking into dangerous territory. "You know what I mean. Something people actually want to watch. Big screen, popcorn, entertainment. Not 2 hours of depressing factory footage." Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The camera caught a production assistant wincing off stage. "I see," Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "So, entertainment value is your measure of what's real or worthwhile." "In this business?" "Absolutely," Carson replied with the confidence of someone who believed they were speaking an obvious truth. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly. "My documentary shows real people whose children have developed rare cancers because corporations valued profit over human lives. I've filmed mothers who have lost children and families who can't afford to move away from the only homes they've ever known, even as those homes slowly poison them." Her voice remained steady, never rising, but carrying an intensity that commanded attention. "Now, you tell me, Carson, what could be more real than that?" The studio fell silent. Even Carson, rarely at a loss for words, seemed momentarily stunned by her response. The camera panned briefly to the audience, where expressions of surprise and admiration were beginning to replace the earlier discomfort. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. What she would say next would not only change the tone of the interview, but would send ripples through social media and the entertainment industry by morning. The daughter of Gene Hackman was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful performances happen not in scripted films, but in moments of authentic truth. The silence that had fallen over the studio was electric. Camera operators exchanged glances, while the floor director frantically signaled to Carson to recover the interview's momentum. The host's usual composure wavered momentarily as he shuffled the note cards on his desk, buying himself precious seconds to regroup. "Well, I certainly didn't mean to suggest your work isn't important," Carson said with a forced chuckle, attempting to backpedal. "It's just that entertainment and serious documentaries appeal to different audiences." Elizabeth's eyes remained fixed on Carson, her father's legendary intensity evident in her steady gaze. "And which audience do you believe matters more?" The question hung in the air, simple yet devastating in its directness. Several audience members nodded unconsciously, drawn into the unexpected depth of the exchange. What had been scheduled as a standard promotional interview was transforming into something far more compelling. Carson reached for his coffee mug, a nervous habit viewers had noticed whenever interviews veered from his control. "All audiences matter, of course, but let's be honest, box office numbers don't lie, do they? Your father's films reached millions. How many people will see your documentary?" A slight smile formed at the corner of Elizabeth's mouth, reminiscent of her father's expression when delivering a pivotal line. "My father taught me something valuable about numbers, Carson. He said true impact isn't always measured by how many people see something, but by how deeply it affects those who do." In the control room, the director whispered into his headset, "Stay on her face." "This is gold." Carson leaned back, his trademark smirk returning as he found more comfortable footing. "Speaking of your father, viewers might be interested to know that Gene Hackman hasn't appeared in a film for nearly 20 years. Word in the industry is that he became difficult to work with toward the end. Any truth to that?" The calculated pivot was obvious, a veteran interviewer's tactic to regain control by shifting to potentially controversial territory. The audience tensed at the thinly veiled provocation. Behind the cameras, a producer winced and muttered, "Bad move." Elizabeth took a slow, deliberate breath. Those familiar with Gene Hackman's career might have recognized it as the same measured pause he often employed before delivering a devastating response in films like Mississippi Burning or The Royal Tenenbaums. "Interesting question, Carson," she began, her voice calm, yet carrying to every corner of the studio. "My father chose to retire at the height of his abilities, with 2 Academy Awards and a legacy of performances that will outlive all of us. He valued authenticity above all else, on screen and off. She paused, allowing her words to settle. Perhaps that's why he declined multiple invitations to appear on your show. A collective intake of breath swept through the audience. On the monitors, the camera caught a flash of genuine surprise in Carson's eyes. This was clearly information he hadn't expected her to possess. Well, schedules are complicated things, Carson replied, his usual smoothness slightly fractured. But let's get back to your documentary. I've heard some critics suggest it's one-sided, that you've ignored economic benefits these companies bring to struggling communities. Elizabeth nodded, as if she'd anticipated the criticism. I interviewed 17 corporate executives for this film. 15 declined to speak on camera. The remaining 2 appear extensively, presenting their full perspective. She reached into her blazer pocket and removed a small notebook. Would you like me to list their names and the dates they were contacted? Carson's eyes darted to his producer off stage, who was making a subtle cutting motion across his throat, a signal to change direction quickly. That won't be necessary, Carson said, forcing a smile while glancing at his watch. We're running short on time. But before we go, I have to ask, your father was known for playing tough characters who stood up to corruption. How much of his influence do we see in your work? It was a better question, one that offered Elizabeth a chance to promote her documentary while acknowledging her father's legacy. For a moment, the tension seemed to ease as Carson appeared to extend an olive branch. Elizabeth's expression softened. My father portrayed characters who fought for justice when systems failed. That's precisely what my documentary aims to do. Give voice to those who have been silenced by powerful interests. Carson nodded, sensing an opportunity to end on a more positive note. And speaking of powerful interests, I understand your next project involves some major political figures. It does, Elizabeth confirmed. It examines how campaign financing influences environmental policy decisions. She paused, then added with perfect timing, including several politicians you've had close relationships with, Carson. The subtle emphasis on close relationships sent a ripple through the audience. Carson's reputation for socializing with political elites was well known in industry circles, but rarely mentioned to his face. His smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. Sounds fascinating, he said, his tone suddenly brisk. We'll have to have you back when that's released. I'd welcome the opportunity, Elizabeth replied with genuine warmth that contrasted with the underlying tension. Especially since you're mentioned in it. The camera caught Carson's expression freezing for a fraction of a second, just long enough for attentive viewers to notice. In the audience, several people covered their mouths to hide their reactions. A woman in the front row audibly gasped. Well, that's all the time we have, Carson announced with professional efficiency, though those who knew him recognized the slight edge in his voice. Elizabeth Hackman's documentary Silent Poisoning premieres next week on National Geographic. We'll be right back after these messages. As the show cut to commercial, the applause sign flashed, but the audience was already clapping with unusual enthusiasm. Elizabeth sat composed in her chair, neither triumphant nor apologetic. Carson leaned toward her while removing his microphone, his expression hidden from the cameras. Whatever words passed between them in that moment would become the subject of intense speculation by morning, when clips of the interview would begin circulating online. But for now, as makeup artists rushed to touch up Carson's increasingly evident perspiration, one thing was clear. Elizabeth Hackman had not only honored her father's legacy, but had created a powerful moment of her own. Backstage, a production assistant whispered to another, "Did you see that?" She never raised her voice, never lost her cool, but she completely owned him. Just like her father would have done, came the reply. When the commercial break ended, the atmosphere in the studio had transformed. The audience, typically content to play their assigned role of responsive laughter and applause, now leaned forward in their seats, eager to witness the next phase of this unexpected duel of words. Carson Williams returned with his smile firmly in place, a consummate professional determined to reclaim control of his show. Welcome back to Late Night with Carson, he announced smoothly to the camera. We're continuing our conversation with Elizabeth Hackman, whose documentary Silent Poisoning examines corporate pollution in rural America. His tone had shifted subtly, more respectful than before, but with an undercurrent of caution. Before the break, you mentioned your next project touches on some political connections. Care to elaborate? Elizabeth's posture remained relaxed, yet dignified. I believe in following evidence wherever it leads, Carson. My work documents how certain industries have influenced environmental policy through strategic relationships with media figures and politicians. She maintained eye contact with unwavering confidence. But I'd rather focus on the families featured in Silent Poisoning. Their stories deserve to be heard. Carson nodded, recognizing her skillful deflection. Of course. Tell us about one of these families. The Richardsons have lived in Millfield for 4 generations, Elizabeth began, her voice taking on a compassionate quality that captivated the audience. Their 10-year-old daughter developed a rare form of leukemia 3 years after a chemical manufacturing plant opened upstream from their property. 8 other children in their neighborhood have been diagnosed with similar conditions. As she spoke, images from her documentary appeared on the screen behind them. Not the stark, depressing footage Carson had dismissively predicted, but powerfully composed scenes showing everyday Americans facing extraordinary challenges with dignity. What these families discovered, Elizabeth continued, was that the company had been cited for improper waste disposal 17 times, yet continued operations without substantial penalties. When they sought accountability, they found themselves up against corporate legal teams with seemingly unlimited resources. Carson, sensing authentic engagement from his audience, leaned forward. And where were the regulatory agencies during all this? That's where the story becomes particularly troubling, Elizabeth replied, recognizing his first genuine question of the evening. Documents we uncovered show that several key officials moved between regulatory positions and board memberships at these same companies. One former agency director now sits on the board of the parent company that owns the Millfield plant. A murmur rippled through the audience. Carson raised an eyebrow, professional curiosity seemingly overcoming his earlier defensiveness. You're alleging a revolving door situation? I'm not alleging anything, Carson. I'm presenting documented facts. Elizabeth removed a small flash drive from her pocket and placed it on the desk between them. This contains public records of every employment transfer mentioned in the film, along with copies of the environmental violation reports and subsequent penalties, or lack thereof. Carson glanced at the flash drive, then back at Elizabeth. The camera caught a moment of genuine indecision in his expression. The calculated television host, briefly replaced by someone confronting uncomfortable truths. The director, sensing a pivotal moment, called for a close-up. You know, Carson said slowly, before tonight, I had certain preconceptions about your work. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. I assumed it was another celebrity offspring trading on a famous name. Elizabeth's expression remained neutral, allowing him to continue without interruption. But I'm starting to think I may have misjudged the situation. Carson's admission came with a reluctance that made it all the more powerful. These sound like stories that deserve attention. A scattered applause began, quickly growing as audience members responded to this unexpected turn. Carson, ever aware of the room's energy, raised his hand to quiet them. That said, he continued, his interviewer's instinct reasserting itself, critics might argue that your father's name opened doors that would remain closed to other documentary filmmakers covering the same issues. The question hung in the air, not entirely unfair, but pointed nonetheless. Many in the audience held their breath, wondering if the fragile rapport would shatter. Elizabeth took a measured breath before responding. My father's name may have opened certain doors, she acknowledged, with a candor that seemed to catch Carson off guard. But what I've done with that access is entirely my own responsibility. She leaned forward slightly, her intensity reminiscent of her father's most compelling performances. And here's what few people know, Carson. When I began this project, I approached 3 major studios using my own name, not my father's. All 3 declined. A small, knowing smile crossed her face. It was only when I couldn't secure funding that my father suggested I use the Hackman name if I truly believed in the project's importance. The revelation landed with quiet power. Even Carson appeared genuinely intrigued. So Gene Hackman encouraged you to use the family name? He said something I'll never forget, Elizabeth replied, her voice softening with the memory. Privilege becomes purpose when it gives voice to those who wouldn't otherwise be heard. She paused, allowing the words to resonate. That's the real legacy I'm trying to honor. The studio fell completely silent. Carson, a man who had interviewed presidents and movie stars, who prided himself on remaining unaffected by emotional appeals, sat momentarily speechless. The camera caught his expression transforming, professional skepticism giving way to something approaching respect. That's a perspective I hadn't considered, he admitted finally. Elizabeth nodded, acknowledging his concession without pressing the advantage. The tension between them had evolved into something more complex, not quite alliance, but a mutual recognition. Your father, Carson said after a moment, was known for his authenticity on screen. No matter what character he played, there was always this underlying truth to his performances. He glanced at the flash drive still sitting between them. I'm beginning to see that same quality in your work. The compliment, seemingly genuine, marked a turning point in the interview. The antagonism that had defined their earlier exchange was dissolving, replaced by something neither the audience nor the production team had anticipated, a conversation of substance. Thank you, Carson, Elizabeth replied simply. That means more than you might realize. For the first time that evening, Carson's smile appeared entirely unscripted. We have about 2 minutes left. Tell our viewers how they can support these families or see your documentary. As Elizabeth provided the details, a production assistant whispered to the floor director, "Did Carson Williams just have an actual change of heart on live television?" The director, who had worked with Carson for 7 years, shook his head in amazement. "In all my time on this show, I've never seen anything like it." What no one in the studio realized was that this exchange would soon travel far beyond the show's regular audience. By morning, the moment would be analyzed by media commentators, shared across social platforms, and viewed millions of times, a rare instance of authentic transformation captured in an industry built on carefully managed perceptions. The morning after Elizabeth Hackman's appearance on Late Night with Carson, the media landscape buzzed with discussion. Clips of the interview spread across social platforms with unprecedented speed, accompanied by headlines ranging from Gene Hackman's daughter outclasses talk show host to Carson Williams meets his match. What had begun as a standard promotional interview had transformed into something far more significant, a moment of authentic human connection that resonated with viewers tired of superficial celebrity exchanges. In network offices, executives gathered around conference tables to analyze the unexpected viral phenomenon. The interview had generated more engagement than any late-night segment in the show's history, with viewership of the full episode climbing steadily on streaming platforms. More significantly, the conversation had sparked genuine public interest in Silent Poisoning, with pre-release ticket sales for the documentary's limited theatrical run selling out in major cities overnight. Meanwhile, in a modest office decorated with framed photographs of environmental restoration projects rather than Hollywood memorabilia, Elizabeth Hackman looked up from her computer, momentarily overwhelmed by the flood of messages. Representatives from major news outlets, streaming services, and film festivals filled her inbox, all requesting interviews or expressing interest in her work. Among them was an email from Carson Williams's personal address, not his show's production team. "Elizabeth," it began, "I've spent the morning watching your documentary in its entirety. It's rare that I find myself reconsidering long-held perspectives, but your work has accomplished exactly that. The families you've featured deserve not only to be seen, but heard at the highest levels. I have connections that may help amplify their stories if you're open to continuing our conversation off camera. With respect, Carson." The message represented something more valuable than the publicity her appearance had generated. It was evidence that authentic communication could sometimes transcend the performative nature of television. 2 days later, as Elizabeth prepared for a panel discussion at a prestigious university, her phone rang with a familiar name on the screen. Her father, Gene Hackman, calling from his home where he had lived quietly since retiring from the film industry. "I saw the interview," he said simply, his distinctive voice carrying the same gravity that had captivated movie audiences for decades. "And?" Elizabeth asked, a trace of her childhood vulnerability momentarily replacing her professional composure. You did something more important than standing up to a talk show host, Jean replied. You stood up for people who needed an advocate. That's worth more than any performance I ever gave. The conversation that followed was private, but its impact was evident when Elizabeth took the stage that evening. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that reminded many in attendance of her father, though she spoke of subjects far removed from the characters he had portrayed. When asked about her viral moment with Carson Williams, she redirected the conversation to the families featured in her documentary, several of whom were present in the audience. The true measure of that interview, she explained, isn't how many views it received, but whether it moves us toward accountability and change. The following week brought perhaps the most unexpected development. Carson Williams, whose show had built its reputation on celebrity gossip and lighthearted entertainment, devoted an unprecedented 30 minutes to a serious discussion of corporate environmental responsibility. His guest panel included two families from Silent Poisoning, a renowned environmental scientist and the CEO of a company recognized for sustainable practices. While Elizabeth wasn't present, her influence on the conversation was unmistakable. Last week, Carson began the segment, this show experienced something unusual, an interview that continued to resonate with me long after the cameras stopped rolling. It prompted me to look more deeply into issues I've admittedly overlooked throughout my career. Viewers accustomed to Carson's polished cynicism witnessed something rarely seen in television personalities, genuine evolution. Ratings for the episode surpassed even those of Elizabeth's appearance, suggesting an audience hunger for substance that many network executives had underestimated. 3 months later, when Silent Poisoning received a prestigious documentary award, Elizabeth Hackman stood at the podium with characteristic composure. Her acceptance speech acknowledged the families who had trusted her with their stories, the crew who had worked tirelessly beside her, and the journalists who had helped bring crucial evidence to light. Then she paused, considering her next words carefully. I also want to acknowledge someone who reminded me that meaningful conversation can happen in unexpected places, she said. Carson Williams approached our interview with one perspective and remained open enough to consider another. In a media landscape that often rewards entrenchment rather than evolution, that openness matters. The camera caught Carson in the audience, nodding with uncharacteristic humility. The man once known primarily for his sharp tongue and celebrity ambushes had become an unlikely ally in elevating Elizabeth's environmental causes to national attention. His weekly show now regularly featured segments on corporate accountability alongside its entertainment coverage, a shift that initially confused his network but ultimately expanded his audience. Perhaps the most profound impact came 6 months after the viral interview, when the EPA announced a comprehensive investigation into the chemical manufacturer featured in Silent Poisoning. The announcement cited compelling documentary evidence and subsequent reporting as factors that necessitated regulatory review. For the families who had fought for acknowledgement of their suffering, it represented the first step toward the justice they had long been denied. On the day of the announcement, Elizabeth received another call from her father. I watched you on the news this morning, Jean said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had witnessed both Hollywood's fictions and life's harsher realities. You've accomplished something real, Elizabeth, something that matters. I learned from the best, she replied. A comfortable silence settled between them before Jean spoke again. Carson Williams called me yesterday. Elizabeth's surprise was evident in her voice. He did? Why? He wanted to discuss the possibility of a special program featuring environmental whistleblowers, Jean explained, and he mentioned something else that I thought you should know. What's that? He said meeting you reminded him of why he wanted to be a journalist before he became an entertainer, said it was time he remembered the difference between the two. As the conversation concluded, Elizabeth looked out her office window at the city below, reflecting on the unexpected journey that had begun with a confrontational interview and evolved into something far more meaningful. What had started as a moment of tension had ultimately created ripples of change that extended far beyond ratings and social media metrics. The true power of authentic voice, she realized, wasn't measured in viral moments or trending topics. It was measured in the lives it touched and the systems it challenged. That was a legacy worthy of the Hackman name and entirely her own.